The 1950s, a time of poodle skirts and saddle shoes, drive-ins, diners, and sock hops. Elvis ruled the radio, and on TV was all about Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. But decades after the 50s have come and gone, pop culture and good old-fashioned nostalgia for simpler times have left us with many misconceptions about the so-called golden era, and we're going to be debunking just a few of them today. Let's get into it. The 50s were only the 1950s. Here's one that might blow your mind. While we might today think of the 1950s as beginning in 1950 and ending in 1959, according to historians, the period of time that many call the 50s and the trends associated with that era started in 1945 and lasted until maybe 1964. That's not how math works, and it's making my brain itch. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to try to keep things firmly in the actual 50s. The 1950s were a peaceful time. According to some, people living in the 1950s had it made. It was basically all American dream all the time. Waving to neighbors over white picket fences, wearing khaki pants. Life was peaceful and life was good. This is perhaps one of the biggest misconceptions about the 1950s, when life actually had plenty of strife and conflict, including a couple of wars. In June 1950, troops from the North Korean military marched into South Korea, kicking off the Korean War, which America entered in July. The war lasted for 3 years. An estimated 5 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were killed. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, and not just because we forgot about it today. Apparently, the US media didn't even really cover it at the time. A couple of decades later, though, the conflict would get its own pop culture moment with a little TV show called MASH. One war that has not been forgotten is the Cold War, the conflict between the communist Soviet Union and the democratic US of A, which began in the 1940s and reached its peak in the early 1950s. The USSR had performed its first nuclear bomb detonation in August 1949, and by the early 1950s, paranoia and anxiety about a possible nuclear attack were so high that kids were doing duck and cover drills in schools, huddling under their desks, arms tightly covering their heads and necks. To teach the proper technique, there was a 1952 educational film called Duck and Cover that featured a turtle named Bert. The film even had a catchy theme song.
Dee-dum-dum, dee-dum-dum, there was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
The film explained that it was important to be prepared for a nuclear attack because if you weren't, the blast could hurt you in different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover, like Bert, you will be much safer. Today we find all of this duck and cover stuff kinda silly, but that was not the case at the time. People who today talk about doing duck and cover drills talk about being terrified by them. Stevens Institute of Technology historian Alex Wellerstein told History.com. They talk about them really hammering home that this stuff is real and that the world is a really disturbing place. The Cold War continued with varying degrees of intensity until the 1980s. So much for peace. Joseph McCarthy put away a ton of communist spies and sympathizers. In February 1950, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed to have a list of over 200 communists working for the State Department. He'd continue attacks for the next few years, but in 1953, the Republicans gained a majority in the Senate and McCarthy became chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. McCarthy's power during this time was basically unchecked, and even his own colleagues were too afraid to stand up to the senator, lest they be accused of being communists themselves. It wasn't until he turned his attention to the US Army that President Eisenhower finally put his foot down. Ike used executive privilege to give government employees permission to ignore McCarthy's subpoenas to testify. The era of McCarthyism culminated in 36 days of televised hearings. At one point, McCarthy accused Joseph Welch, the attorney for the Army, of employing someone who had once belonged to a communist group, leading Welch to ask, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" Eventually, the Senate censured McCarthy, and soon, the era of McCarthyism was finished. Thanks to all of McCarthy's aggrandizing, it's easy to assume that he probably unearthed a ton of communist activity and put a bunch of people in prison. But the senator never actually sent a single person to jail, because by the time he ramped up his efforts, according to Louis Menand at The New Yorker, there were almost no communists left to fire or spies left to convict, thanks to previous efforts to weed them out in the late 1940s. Or at least there wasn't enough evidence to put people away. To be clear, many people with suspected communist ties were sent to jail during this era, but weird as it is to say, McCarthy is not McCarthyism. He just exemplifies the second Red Scare. It's other groups and other investigations. Don't conflate McCarthy's inquiries with the House Committee of Un-American Activities, which began in 1938. The 1950s were uniformly prosperous. Generally speaking, the 1950s were a time of post-war prosperity where the economy was booming. Some even had the idea that during the 50s, everybody had a long-term steady job that they held onto until they retired. Affluence was the norm, but that's not quite right. Yes, the 1950s were a period of economic growth, but there were also two recessions between 1950 and 1959. The first, which occurred after the Korean War when the government dialed back on wartime spending, lasted from July 1953 to May 1954. Unemployment peaked at almost 6% and prices were high. The next recession in the 50s occurred in the midst of a global recession that in a small part was caused by a flu pandemic. It hit in August 1957 and lasted until April 1958, and unemployment hit nearly 7.5%. A pandemic leading to a recession? Who could imagine? This golden era does not seem so golden, huh? And we're not even close to being done. Next, America became more equal during the 1950s. Here's a misconception that was being peddled during the 1950s. The economy was so good, the story went, that life got better and more equal for everyone, and a literal sharing of the wealth. Many Americans got a lot wealthier during the 1950s, but not all. And as Columbia University American History professor Alan Brinkley writes for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, while total wealth increased, that wealth was not redistributed any differently than it had been previously. Distribution patterns, in other words, remained unchanged. The wealthy and the poor experienced roughly the same rates of growth. The gap between them remained the same. As Stephanie Kuntz writes in her book, The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap, as many as 50 million Americans were poor in the mid-50s, noting that, in the absence of food stamps and housing programs, this poverty was searing. By the end of the 50s, Kuntz writes, a third of American children were poor. Inequality wasn't just an economic issue. Post-World War II, 18 million people moved to the suburbs in part thanks to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill. This legislation was, as its nickname suggests, a way to help returning World War II veterans by providing them with things like low-interest mortgages so they could buy homes and money for tuition so they could go to school along with medical care and weekly unemployment benefits. White veterans began buying up houses in suburban areas in droves. But the key word there is white. Black veterans were largely not able to use the benefits provided by the GI Bill. The bill itself didn't exclude them, but some racist Southern senators held out until they secured that the act would be administered locally rather than federally. Those state-level administrators followed the Federal Housing Authority's lending guidelines, which, according to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, restricted housing assistance on the condition that prospective homeowners not buy homes in D-rated communities, which were deemed risky investments. Because the presence of even one black family could earn a neighborhood a D grade, this policy effectively restricted housing assistance to white Americans purchasing homes in white neighborhoods. Even if they were able to secure some of the benefits, the US was still segregated at that time, ensuring that Black Americans' options for education and housing were minimal at best. Landmark legislation enacted during the 1950s didn't necessarily make things more equal either. 1954's Brown v. Board of Education may have ended school segregation on paper, but it persisted in many places. And let's not forget that 1955 saw both the brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till for supposedly flirting with a white woman who we know lied about the incident, and Rosa Parks being arrested for not giving up her bus seat to a white man, kicking off the Montgomery bus boycott. According to History.com, during the 1950s, the struggle against racism and segregation entered the mainstream of American life. So, No, things were not especially equal during the 1950s, not by any measure of the imagination. The nuclear family was a long-standing bedrock of American life. If all you know about the 50s comes from Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, one can hardly blame you for thinking that the middle-class nuclear family unit, a dad who goes off to work, a mom who stays home to do the housework and care for their 2 kids and the dog, all living in a beautiful home complete with a white picket fence and the burbs, was par for the course in the 1950s. But this series is called Misconceptions, so if we're bringing something up, you know what we're gonna do next. Kuntz writes in The Way We Never Were that nuclear families did exist. They were both a new invention and a historical fluke based on a unique and temporary conjuncture of economic, social, and political factors. But the situation was decidedly more complex than TV would have you believe. Take, for example, the role of women as happy homemakers. June Cleaver was perfectly content to stay home and devote herself to housework, but for a lot of real women, that was a harder pill to swallow. Many had entered the workforce during World War II while the country's men were off fighting. And by 1945, most of them had decided that they would like to stay working, thank you very much. But when the war was over, they were either fired or demoted to what were considered female jobs, which of course came with lower pay. Women who didn't want to stay home, according to Kuntz, were labeled neurotic, perverted, or schizophrenic. And I cannot emphasize this enough, TF. And as we mentioned before, a whole lot of people were pretty poor in the 50s, which is a starkly different story than what was seen on TV. TV was also nearly uniformly white, and while America was majority white at the time, the country was also significantly more diverse than what was on TV screens. According to the book Television and the American Family, 97% of families on television during the 50s were white. 2% Hispanic, 1% Native American, and 0% African American or Asian American. And as Kuntz points out, non-white groups were almost entirely excluded from the gains and privileges accorded white middle-class families. And as Alice Rebold notes on Medium's Exploring History, women have always worked. Whether this be in agriculture or food production, women did it. More than that, they did it and balanced having children at the same time. Even 200 years ago, most women in Europe and the USA worked. If we take a wider historical perspective of family types, there's nothing particularly traditional about the nuclear family. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that this family form emerged in Western countries, and it only grew to its most prevalent in the 1950s. The fact is, then, as now, and in the time before the 50s, there was no one kind of normal family, no matter what TV might show you. You might think that the term nuclear family was coined in the 50s because of all of the hubbub about nuclear weapons, but that's not the case. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term nuclear family was coined by anthropologist Bronislaw Kasper Malinowski in a 1924 issue of the journal Psyche, and it had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. If you read his papers, it's an extension of a concept in Freudianism called the nuclear complex, which is why he calls it the nuclear family complex. How a concept in psychoanalysis became a term for a generic 50s family is a long story, but if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, we dropped a link in the description to a fascinating article all about it. The 1950s were extremely conservative. Thanks to the fact that marriages were at an all-time high, divorce rates were declining, the baby boom was a-boomin', and church attendance was on the rise, many assumed that the 1950s were a conservative era where conformity was the norm. And maybe there's some truth to that, but there was plenty of dissent happening. The participants in the civil rights movement were not just letting the status quo endure, nor were the Beats, who University of Washington history professor William Rohrbaugh called the first post-war critics of American society and culture. Figures like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac protested and challenged societal norms, especially those surrounding sex, drug use, and American materialism. In 1955, Ginsberg performed a reading of his poem Howl about the many failings of American society. When the poem was published a year later, Ginsberg's publisher ended up in court for charges of obscenity, but was acquitted in 1957. The avant-garde movement, which was putting society on blast via art, music, theater, and films, was also going strong at this time. The interstate highway system was President Eisenhower's idea. One of the most pervasive misconceptions about the 1950s is that President Eisenhower came up with the idea for the interstate highway system. And when the thing goes by the name Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, what else are you supposed to think? But the idea actually goes all the way back to a report for Congress from 1939 with the scintillating title, Toll Roads and Free Roads. And the highway was authorized by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944. Ike, who, as a former general, understood the importance of roads for moving people and things around, supported the construction and signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which paved the way. Get it? I hate myself. For funding and building the system. The food in the 50s was super gross. A couple of years ago, a meme began circulating that featured an ad for Campbell's cream of mushroom that included a recipe for, wait for it, tuna and waffles. The meme part was a line of text stating, the 1950s were a lawless hellscape. This recipe was not a one-off. The 50s were a time of dishes that seem downright bizarre to us today. Take, for example, the Jell-O salads that were all the craze back then, which could include ingredients like grated onion, cottage cheese, and fish salad. I actually ate a similar recipe from a cookbook published in the 1960s, and as you can see in this clip, bon appetit. Oh, there's so many textures. Wow, it's salty. It was not my favorite dish. There are a few things that separate foods of the 50s from dishes of today. One is that there just wasn't as much variety as there is these days, and what people can afford is much different too. A lot of stuff we buy without blinking today was much pricier in the mid-20th century. But there's something else at play entirely with recipes like the one featured in the meme. Many of the food products hitting shelves in the 40s and 50s were brand new, and because of that, according to Food and Drink magazine, no one knew what to do with them. To make them more popular and also encourage them to be a part of family dinners, companies created recipes with them. The problem is, most companies didn't know where to begin cooking with them either, so they ended up with some fairly weird recipes along the way. The recipes apparently weren't even tested by the people creating them. There might also be a bit of snobbishness at play here too. The fact of the matter is, people in the 1950s likely made these recipes and probably also enjoyed them. They only seem gross to our modern palates, which, it should be said, eat plenty of foods that our descendants are probably going to deem gross. I mean, what the heck even are gushers? Poodle skirts and saddle shoes were the height of fashion. If you're a fan of movies like Grease or shows like Happy Days, you probably have a very specific idea of what 1950s fashion was like, and it probably includes poodle skirts, fancy blouses, and saddle shoes. But as vintage beauty and fashion YouTuber Carolina Zabrowska points out in a video about 50s fashion that we'll link to below, those fits were reserved for young people. Anything really fashion-oriented was aimed at adults and was totally different. It was what young people wore at the time, but young people did not dictate fashion. Young people's outfits were not what you would show in Vogue. What you would show in Vogue or fashion magazines were dresses for people over 30, 40, 50. Here's an example of what a typical adult might wear. No polka dots in sight. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to 1950s misconceptions. If there are any you would have included in the video, or if you want more clips of me struggling to eat tuna Jell-O, pop a comment down below. Thanks for watching.